Long before written history, long before kingdoms carved their borders into the earth, there existed quiet gatherings known only through whispers. The old circles. These were not places of spectacle or chaos, but hidden sanctuaries where early seekers tried to understand the unseen forces moving beneath the world's surface. To them, every shadow carried a message, every flame a memory, every silence a doorway. What later generations would call black magic began not as evil, but as humanity's attempt to listen to the deeper rhythms of existence. These ancient practices survived through murmurs. Stories carried by firelight, symbols carved into stone, and rituals preserved only in the memory of those bold enough to stand on the edge of the unknown. In the earliest ages, before language had fully settled into shape and before memory learned to stay in fixed forms, humans gathered instinctively in circles. The circle was not chosen for meaning, yet meaning slowly gathered within it. It formed around fire, around warmth, around the faint comfort of shared breath in the dark. The flames did not merely cook food or chase predators away. They moved, spoke, breathed, and listened. To those early watchers, fire was alive in a way no other thing was. It shifted color like emotion, rose and fell like a living chest, and consumed offerings with visible hunger. Sitting close to it, humans felt something watching back. Night arrived without warning in those times. There were no lamps, no walls to hold the darkness at bay. When the sun sank, the world dissolved into sound and shadow. Wind slipped through grasses like unseen hands. Insects hummed in steady rhythms. Distant calls echoed from throats that could not be seen. The sky stretched endlessly above, heavy with stars, each one sharp and unreachable. In that vastness, humans felt small but not alone. The darkness seemed occupied, filled with presence rather than emptiness. Around the fire, the circle became a boundary between the known and the unknown, between light that could be touched and shadow that could not. These gatherings were not ceremonies as later ages would understand them. There were no rules, no fixed words, no deliberate attempt to command or control. There was only attention. Faces turned toward the flames, eyes reflecting orange and gold, breathing slowing as the night deepened. Someone would speak, not loudly, not formally, but as if addressing something just beyond the edge of sight. The words were simple at first, sounds shaped by emotion rather than meaning. Gratitude for warmth, fear of storms, hope for tomorrow's hunt. These sounds drifted upward with the smoke dissolving into the night air. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain nights felt heavier, quieter, as though the world itself were listening more closely. Storms gathered without warning, clouds rolling in thick and low, thunder rumbling like a distant voice. The people learned that speaking to the fire before such nights brought a sense of calm, a feeling of being acknowledged even if nothing changed. When rains arrived gently instead of violently, the connection felt confirmed. When animals returned to familiar paths after long absences, it seemed like a response. Slowly, without realizing it, humans began to believe they were not merely surviving the world, but conversing with it. The seasons themselves appeared alive. Winter came like a stern visitor, stripping the land bare, demanding patience and restraint. Spring returned softly, carrying renewal in its hands. Summer burned with excess and abundance. Autumn whispered of endings and preparation. Around the fire, these changes were spoken of not as natural processes, but as moods, decisions, and movements of unseen forces. The wind was not random, it carried intention. The rain did not fall without cause. It answered something unspoken. Fate was not abstract. It felt close, personal, capable of listening. Within the circle, silence became as important as sound. There were moments when speech felt wrong, when only stillness seemed appropriate. In those pauses, people sensed something passing through them, something subtle yet undeniable. Gooseflesh rose on arms. Breathing slowed. The fire crackled differently, sending sparks upward like fleeting thoughts. These moments taught them that not everything required action. Sometimes the deepest connection came through waiting, through allowing the unseen to move without interference. Children grew up within these circles, absorbing the atmosphere long before understanding it. They learned that night was not merely absence of day, but a separate realm with its own rules. Elders watched them carefully, noticing which children lingered near the fire longer than others, which stared into the flames with unusual focus, which listened more than they spoke. No one named these differences, but they were remembered. Over generations, certain individuals became known for their sensitivity to the unseen. They were the ones who sensed storms before clouds formed, who dreamed of events before they happened, who felt uneasy when danger approached. Dreams themselves were treated as messages, rather than illusions. Sleep was not escape but travel. When someone dreamed vividly, the story was shared at the next gathering, spoken carefully, respectfully. Dreams of animals were listened to closely. Dreams of water, fire, or falling were discussed in hushed tones. The line between waking life and dreaming life was thin, and the fire sat at its center, bridging both states. The night after a powerful dream often involved longer silence, fewer words, and a feeling of quiet reverence. There was no separation between the spiritual and the practical. Hunting, gathering, healing, and storytelling all flowed into one another. Before a hunt, a portion of food or herbs might be placed into the fire, not as sacrifice in the later sense, but as acknowledgement. The fire had given warmth and light. Returning something felt balanced. If illness spread through the group, the sick were brought close to the flames. Hands hovered over embers, feeling heat without touching, imagining strength moving from fire to flesh. Whether or not recovery followed, the act itself created comfort and unity. As generations passed, the circle became memory itself. Even when fires were lit elsewhere, even when groups traveled or split, the instinct to form a circle remained. Stones were arranged deliberately. Paths were walked repeatedly until the earth itself remembered the shape. These places began to feel different from ordinary ground. The air felt heavier, quieter. Animals avoided them or passed through cautiously. The people did not question why. They simply knew these spaces held something accumulated, something layered by countless nights of attention and belief. The invisible forces they addressed had no names. Names would come later, shaped by language, culture, and fear. At this stage, there was only presence. The forces were neither good nor evil. They were vast, slow, and indifferent in the way mountains and rivers are indifferent. Humans did not seek dominance over them. They sought alignment, understanding, and favor through respect. The idea of control had not yet entered the relationship. What later ages would label as magic was, in these early circles, simply listening deeply to the world. Storms were among the most powerful reminders of this unseen presence. When lightning split the sky and thunder shook the ground, fear and awe merged into one sensation. The fire burned low, protected carefully, while voices softened. People spoke to the storm as if it could hear, asking it to pass gently, to spare the children, to leave enough of the land untouched for survival. When storms passed without devastation, gratitude flowed easily. When destruction came, it was accepted as a message not yet understood. Binatu stood. Time itself felt different around the fire. Without clocks or calendars, nights blended into one another. Memory was marked by events rather than dates. The winter of deep snow, the year the river rose too high. The night the stars seemed closer than ever before. These memories were retold in circles, shaping a shared sense of past and future. Fate was not fixed but fluid, influenced by attention, intention, and the quiet exchange between human and unseen. As societies slowly grew more complex, as groups expanded and leadership structures emerged, these early practices began to change. But in their original form, the first circles were innocent of ambition. They held no desire to bend reality to human will. They existed as meeting places between breath and flame, between fear and wonder. What later generations would fear and call dark began here as something gentle, curious, and deeply human. The fire eventually dimmed as dawn approached, its glow paling against the rising light. People slept where they sat, wrapped in shared warmth, dreams drifting easily among them. The unseen did not disappear with the sun. It merely retreated, waiting for night to return. And when darkness fell again, the circle would form once more. Hands reaching toward flame, voices lowering, listening again for the murmurs that had always been there. In these first circles, before magic had a name, humanity learned its earliest lesson about power, that the world responds not only to action, but to attention, and not only to strength, but to stillness. The legacy of those nights remains buried beneath modern thought, quietly pulsing whenever a flame captures the gaze, whenever silence feels alive, whenever the dark feels less like absence and more like a presence patiently waiting to be heard. In the age when the old circles still gathered without names or symbols, darkness was not something to be driven away. It was not an enemy, nor a threat pressing against the edge of firelight. Darkness was a condition of learning, a vast and patient space where the world spoke more softly and therefore more clearly. When the flames dimmed and shadows grew long, the people did not rush to restore brightness. They allowed the dark to settle, to stretch, to fill the spaces between breath and thought. In that settling, they believed, truth became easier to hear. But night removed excess. It softened the world into shapes and sounds, reducing everything to essentials. In darkness, the eyes could no longer dominate understanding. Other senses rose to take their place. Hearing sharpened, catching the faintest changes in wind or footfall. Smell carried deeper meaning, signaling rain, fire, animals, or decay. Even the skin seemed more alert, responding to temperature shifts and unseen proximity. In this state, intuition was no longer drowned out by distraction. The old circles noticed that thoughts behaved differently in shadow. During the day, the mind followed clear lines: cause, effect, need, action. At night, thought loosened. Memories surfaced without invitation. Emotions drifted forward gently, unforced. Questions arose that had no immediate answers, and instead of causing fear, these questions felt welcome. Darkness allowed uncertainty to exist without urgency. It taught patience not through instruction, but through atmosphere. Shadows themselves were treated as signs rather than distortions. A shadow was not considered absence of light, but a meeting place where light ended and something else began. When figures moved near the fire, their shadows stretched and merged, blending into one another. This merging suggested a deeper truth, that boundaries between individuals were less fixed than daylight implied. Around the fire, in shadow, identity softened. People felt less separate, more connected, as if the dark gently dissolved the edges between selves. The old circles believed that the unseen world was not distant, but layered closely alongside the visible one. Darkness thinned the barrier between these layers, not because something invaded from elsewhere, but because human perception shifted. With sight reduced, awareness expanded inward and outward at once. What later generations would call intuition was, to them, simply another sense becoming audible when others grew quiet. There were nights when the dark felt especially alive. Clouds covered the stars completely, erasing even their distant glow. On such nights, firelight seemed smaller, more fragile. Instead of resisting this, the people leaned into it. They spoke less, they listened more. It was believed that on these nights, the world's deeper movements could be felt beneath the surface, like slow currents beneath still water. Decisions made in such darkness were trusted more than those made in bright certainty. Fear, when it appeared, was not rejected. It was examined. The old circles understood that fear sharpened attention. A sudden sound in the dark forced stillness, forced listening. Fear made the body alert and present. Rather than treating it as weakness, they treated it as a teacher that pointed towards something requiring awareness. Only panic was discouraged because panic closed the senses. Charity of fear held calmly was respected. Children were gradually introduced to darkness rather than shielded from it. They were taught to sit without fire for short periods, holding hands, breathing slowly. The elders guided them to name sounds rather than imagine threats: wind through trees, water over stone, insects moving through grass. Over time, children learned that most of what lived in the dark was indifferent to them. This understanding replaced terror with curiosity. The dark became familiar, even comforting, a place where imagination could wander without being overwhelmed. Dreams grew deeper for those who embraced darkness while awake. Sleep came more easily after nights spent listening, rather than speaking. Dreams were believed to originate from the same realm that shadows belonged to. By honoring darkness, one invited clearer dreams, more honest visions. Those who avoided the dark were said to dream less vividly, their inner sight dulled by constant brightness. The boundary between waking and dreaming was especially thin in deep night. Sitting close to extinguished fire, with only embers glowing faintly, people sometimes entered states of half-sleep. In these moments, thoughts drifted freely, unanchored by logic. Images rose and faded without effort. A sense of presence often accompanied these states, not as a figure or voice, but as awareness itself becoming wider. These experiences were not shared lightly. They were considered personal lessons, shaped uniquely for each listener. Darkness also taught humility. In shadow, humans were reminded of their limitations. Sight failed. Distance vanished. The world no longer arranged itself neatly. This loss of control was not resented, it was accepted as necessary. The old circles believed that arrogance belonged to daylight, when everything seemed visible and manageable. Darkness corrected this illusion, reminding people that much existed beyond understanding, and that peace came from accepting this rather than resisting it. There were places where darkness felt deeper than elsewhere. Caves, dense forests, narrow valleys where sunlight rarely lingered. These places were approached slowly and respectfully. People entered them not to conquer or explore aggressively, but to listen. Time spent in such darkness was brief but meaningful. Emerging from it often brought clarity, as if the mind had been rinsed clean of excess thought. Shadows were also believed to preserve memory. Places where events had occurred, births, deaths, moments of great emotion, seemed darker afterward, even in daylight. The old circles believed that shadows lingered where attention had once been intense. Sitting in such places felt different, heavier, quieter. These shadows were not feared. They were honored as echoes, reminders that the world remembered human presence long after voices faded. As generations passed, some began to misuse darkness, projecting fear into it, rather than learning from it. Stories grew sharper, filled with warnings and imagined threats. But the old circles in their earliest form resisted this shift. They taught that darkness did not deceive. Humans deceived themselves within it. The dark merely reflected what was brought into it. Calm entered calmly. Fear entered fearfully. In this way, darkness became a mirror. Those who sat with anger felt it rise. Those who carried grief felt it surface. Those who held curiosity felt wonder expand. The lesson was not that darkness created these states, but that it removed distraction, allowing truth to appear. This was why the old circles trusted the dark more than the light. Light could hide through excess. Darkness revealed through simplicity. Over time, the language of shadows grew richer. Certain patterns were noticed. Flickering fire casting broken shadows suggested change. Steady shadows suggested stability. Moving shadows without visible cause were taken as signs of internal restlessness, rather than external presence. Interpretation was never fixed. It evolved with experience, shaped by reflection rather than doctrine. As the fire burned lower and shadows reclaimed the circle, the people felt closer to one another. Voices softened, movements slowed. The world outside the circle seemed distant, almost unreal. Within this darkened space, listening replaced doing, and being replaced striving. The old circles believed that this state was not rare or special, but natural, a condition modern life would later forget. When dawn finally approached, darkness withdrew gently, without resentment. It left behind a sense of quiet understanding, like a lesson absorbed without words. The people rose slowly, carrying this understanding into daylight. Darkness was not left behind. It was carried inward, becoming intuition, memory, restraint. In this way, shadows became teachers not through instruction, but through presence. They taught by removing excess, by softening edges, by inviting listening instead of action. They showed that truth did not always arrive as revelation, but often as quiet recognition. And long after the old circles faded into story and myth, this lesson remained, waiting patiently whenever darkness fell and someone chose, even briefly, to listen rather than turn away. As human communities grew larger and more permanent, the quiet balance that once existed between people and the unseen world began to shift. The old circles did not disappear suddenly. They faded gradually, absorbed into daily life, reshaped by changing needs. Villages formed, then towns, then early cities. Land was claimed, boundaries drawn, roles assigned. With structure came stability, but also division. What had once been shared listening slowly turned into managed belief. In the earliest settled communities, the old practices still lingered. Fires were lit at night not only for warmth, but out of habit, memory, and comfort. People still spoke softly to the dark, still listened for signs and dreams, still trusted intuition alongside reason. But as populations increased, so did the need for order. Decisions could no longer be made collectively in silence. Authority emerged, first subtly, then firmly. Certain voices began to matter more than others. Those who showed sensitivity to the unseen were once valued simply as listeners. Now they stood out. Some were invited closer to leadership, asked to advise on matters of weather, health, or fate. Others were watched cautiously. Knowledge, once fluid and shared, began to concentrate. When something can be controlled, it can be protected. When it can be protected, it can be withheld. Rituals that had once been spontaneous began to repeat. Gestures were copied. Words were remembered and spoken again in the same order. What had been instinctive slowly hardened into form. This brought comfort to many, because repetition felt reliable. But repetition also created difference. There were now correct ways and incorrect ways. Deviations were noticed. Quiet experimentation, once welcomed, became suspect. As belief systems formed, they competed for influence. Each sought to explain the unseen in ways that supported its own structure. Stories were reshaped to reinforce authority. The unseen world, once neutral and vast, began to be described in terms of alignment and opposition. Forces were labeled helpful or harmful, welcomed or forbidden. Fear entered not because the unseen had changed, but because certainty demanded boundaries. Practices that did not fit neatly into the new systems were questioned. Listening without guidance felt dangerous. Acting without permission felt rebellion. The old habit of sitting with darkness, of waiting for understanding to rise naturally, was increasingly seen as unproductive or even threatening. Leaders preferred answers that could be taught, repeated, and enforced. At first, nothing was banned outright. Instead, some practices were simply discouraged. They were said to be unnecessary, outdated, or inefficient. Younger generations were guided away from them gently. Elders who still spoke of listening to shadows found fewer willing ears. Their words were not attacked. They were ignored. But ignoring knowledge does not erase it. The old practices continued quietly, practiced by those who felt their value deeply but could not explain it in the new language of rules and hierarchies. These individuals met away from public spaces, not out of malice, but out of caution. Silence became protection. Privacy became necessity. As belief systems grew more rigid, rival explanations of the unseen emerged. Each system claimed truth, often defining itself by what it rejected. Anything outside the approved understanding was labeled dangerous, misleading, or corrupting. The unseen world became a battlefield of ideas rather than a shared mystery. It was during this time that fear reshaped language. Practices that focused on darkness, intuition, and silence were increasingly associated with chaos and disorder. Darkness, once a teacher, framed as a threat. Silence was no longer wisdom but secrecy. Listening without guidance was seen as vulnerability to deception. Leaders, whether spiritual or political, understood the power of naming. To name something is to define it, to place it within limits. The old practices had no names of their own, which made them difficult to control. So names were given to them by outsiders, names heavy with warning and judgment. What had once been sacred exploration became something ominous, something whispered about with unease. The term that would later be translated as a black magic did not arise from within the practice itself. It was imposed from the outside, shaped by fear rather than understanding. The black no longer referred to depth or mystery, but to danger. Magic no longer meant listening or alignment, but manipulation and threat. The meaning shifted, narrowing until it no longer resembled its origin. Those who continued the old ways found themselves increasingly isolated. Some adapted, disguising their practices within acceptable rituals. Others withdrew entirely, passing knowledge quietly within families or trusted circles. What had once been communal became hidden not because it was harmful, but because it no longer fit the dominant narrative. Stories began to change. Where once tales spoke of humans listening to the world, new stories warned of humans who listened too deeply. Curiosity became suspicion. Independence became rebellion. The unseen world, once a shared presence, was now portrayed as something that must be mediated by authority to be safe. Fear served a purpose. It unified groups, strengthened boundaries, reinforced obedience. By warning against forbidden knowledge, leaders protected not only belief systems but social order. If people trusted their own intuition too much, they might question commands, traditions, or hierarchies. Forbidden knowledge was not always dangerous in itself. It was dangerous to control. Over time, the image of the practitioner changed. The quiet listener became the secret manipulator. The observer of shadows became the summoner of threats. Nuance vanished. Complexity flattened into accusation. Few bothered to understand what was actually practiced. It was enough to believe that it was wrong. Yet the forbidden knowledge persisted. It always does. Knowledge rooted in human experience cannot be erased completely. It adapts. It hides. It waits. In remote places, people still sat with darkness, still trusted dreams, still listened for subtle movements beneath the surface of things. They did not always call it anything. Naming had proven dangerous. As generations passed, the distance between the old practices and public understanding widened. Rumors filled the gap. Anything hidden became exaggerated. Anything misunderstood became feared. Stories of harm spread more easily than stories of quiet insight. Forbidden knowledge became larger in imagination than it ever was in reality. Ironically, this fear gave it power. What is forbidden draws attention. What is whispered about grows sharper in the mind. The label of a black magic transformed simple practices into symbols of rebellion, danger, and mystery. People who knew nothing of the original ways now feared them deeply. Those who practiced quietly understood this shift. Some stopped entirely, deciding that silence was safer than continuity. Others adapted further, removing anything that could be misinterpreted. But a few accepted the label without agreement, carrying the knowledge with careful restraint. They understood that survival sometimes requires wearing the names given by others, while protecting the truth beneath. The rise of forbidden knowledge was not the rise of something new, but the narrowing of something old. What had once been open listening became secret preservation. What had once been shared understanding became guarded memory. The unseen world did not change. Human fear did. As belief systems solidified into institutions, forbidden knowledge became a tool of contrast. By defining what was not allowed, leaders clarified what was permitted. Yet beneath the weight of labels and fear, the original essence remained untouched. The practice of listening, of sitting with uncertainty, of trusting subtle awareness, continued quietly wherever humans found themselves alone with darkness. It appeared in solitary walks at night, in silent reflection, in dreams that felt more real than waking life. The rise of forbidden knowledge was, in truth, the story of humanity struggling with its own depth. Faced with the vastness of the unseen, some chose structure and certainty. Others chose curiosity and patience. When these paths collided, fear named what it could not contain. And so what was once sacred exploration became something hidden, not because it lost its value, but because the world around it lost its tolerance for mystery. The forbidden knowledge did not vanish. It simply stepped back into shadow, waiting for quieter times, carried forward by those who remembered that darkness was never the enemy. In the long centuries after the old ways were pushed into shadow, there remained a small and quiet lineage of people who refused to let them vanish completely. They did not call themselves keepers, and they rarely thought of what they carried as a duty. To them it was simply life lived attentively, guided by habits passed down through gesture, tone, and silence rather than written instruction. These individuals often moved at the edges of society, not out of rebellion, but because the center had grown too loud, too rigid, too suspicious of anything that could not be explained or controlled. Some wandered from place to place, following seasonal work, no clear path at all. At Omir, others settled in remote valleys, forests, deserts, or coastlines where isolation was not punishment but relief. Distance offered safety. Far from crowded towns and watchful authority, they could practice without explanation. Their homes were simple, often temporary. They carried little because the knowledge they preserved was not bound to objects. It lived in memory, in rhythm, in breath. The symbols they kept were not elaborate. Many were simple shapes scratched into wood, stone, or earth. Circles, spirals, lines broken or unbroken. To outsiders, these markings meant nothing or seemed decorative at best. But to the keepers, each symbol was a reminder rather than a command. It pointed the mind toward a state of awareness, a way of listening, a memory of how attention should move. Symbols were never worshipped. They were guides, like footprints left by those who had walked the path before. Chants, too, were preserved quietly. They were not songs meant for performance, nor spells intended to force outcomes. They were rhythms that steadied the breath and focused the mind. Many were barely more than hums or repeated syllables with no fixed meaning. Their power lay not in words, but in vibration, spoken softly, often under the breath. Synchronized heartbeat and thought, easing the listener into stillness. Over generations, pronunciations shifted, syllables softened, but the rhythm remained intact. Dream rituals were perhaps the most carefully guarded practices of all. Dreams had always been central to the old ways, but as fear grew around anything unseen, dreaming itself became suspect. The keepers did not announce their trust in dreams. They simply listened to them. Before sleep, they prepared quietly, reducing noise, dimming light, calming the breath. Sometimes a symbol was traced in the air or on the ground. Sometimes a chant was whispered once, then allowed to fade. Sleep was entered intentionally, as one enters a quiet room. Upon waking, dreams were not interpreted hastily. They were allowed to settle, like sediment in water. The keepers knew that meaning revealed itself slowly. They did not force symbols into fixed explanations. A river in a dream was not always change. A shadow was not always fear. Each dream belonged to the dreamer alone, shaped by inner landscapes as much as outer ones. This refusal to generalize protected the practice from becoming rigid or dogmatic. Isolation shaped these practitioners, but it did not harden them. In fact, many were known for gentleness. Without large communities reinforcing identity, ego softened naturally. The keepers learned patience from solitude. Long stretches of quiet taught them to observe rather than react. They spoke little, but when they did, their words carried weight because they were chosen carefully. Knowledge was passed down rarely and selectively. Not everyone was taught everything. Apprenticeship, when it happened at all, was so. A child might grow up near someone who practiced quietly, absorbing habits unconsciously. They learned when to be silent, when to listen, when to wait. Only later did understanding surface, often through experience rather than explanation. This method protected the knowledge from misuse, not through secrecy alone, but through depth. One could not use what one did not yet understand. Many keepers lived unnoticed lives. They were healers known for calm presence rather than dramatic cures. They were travelers welcome for wisdom rather than authority. They were elders who listened more than they spoke. Few people suspected that these individuals carried fragments of a much older world, one that had learned to move gently through darkness rather than conquer it. Some keepers carried physical objects passed through generations. A smooth stone, a carved piece of bone, a length of cord knotted in a particular pattern. These objects were not talismans in the common sense. They held no power on their own. Their purpose was memory. Holding them recalled a posture of mind, a way of breathing, a lesson learned long ago. If an object was lost, the knowledge was not. This was intentional. Attachment to objects made practices vulnerable. The wandering keepers often acted as quiet bridges between distant places. Moving slowly from region to region, they carried variations of the old practices, adapting them gently to local landscapes. A chant learned near the sea might be altered in the mountains to match wind rather than waves. Symbols shifted subtly depending on terrain. This flexibility kept the practices alive. Rigid traditions break easily, living ones bend. Despite their care, danger was never absent. Periods of intense fear swept through societies, driven by rumor, conflict, or sudden change. During such times, anything unfamiliar became suspect. Some keepers were forced deeper into hiding. Others abandoned outward practice entirely, holding the knowledge inwardly until it was safe to breathe again. A few were lost, silenced by fear or violence. Their knowledge survived only where it had already been shared quietly. What united the keepers across generations was not belief, but relationship. They did not claim special power or status. They saw themselves as listeners rather than controllers. The unseen world was not something to command, but something to respect. This attitude set them apart from later caricatures of dark practitioners. The keepers did not seek dominance over forces. They sought harmony with them. Over time, the outside world's image of such individuals grew increasingly distorted. Stories painted them as dangerous, manipulative, or cruel. The keepers themselves rarely corrected these myths. Silence was safer than explanation. To argue was to draw attention. To remain unnoticed was survival. Many accepted being misunderstood, knowing that truth did not require recognition to exist. In isolation, the keepers developed strong inner landscapes. Without constant validation from others, they learned to trust subtle feedback. Sense of imbalance in the body signaled the need for rest. A repeated dream suggested attention was required. Changes in the environment were felt intuitively rather than measured. This deep attunement made them appear uncanny to outsiders, though it was simply the result of long practice in listening. Not all keepers lived apart. Some remained within communities, blending seamlessly into daily life. They practiced invisibly, using common gestures and routines as cover. A lullaby sung to a child carried an old rhythm. A blessing spoken before a meal echoed ancient gratitude. A moment of shared silence held more meaning than words. In this way, fragments of the old ways survived even where fear was strongest. The lineage was never pure or uninterrupted. Knowledge thinned in places, deepened in others. Some practices were lost entirely. Others evolved beyond recognition. But the core remained remarkably stable. Attention, patience, humility, and trust in subtle awareness. These qualities required no symbols or chants to survive. They lived in behavior. As centuries passed, the world grew louder. Writing replaced memory. Rules replaced intuition. Light replaced darkness. Yet even in the busiest times, the keepers remained. They adapted to new surroundings, new dangers, new misunderstandings. The practices became quieter, simpler, harder to detect. What could not be erased was internalized. The keepers understood something essential. Knowledge that depends on approval will always be fragile. Knowledge rooted in experience endures. By refusing to seek recognition, they protected what mattered most. The old symbols, chants, and dream rituals were not preserved exactly as they once were. They were preserved as living processes, capable of change without losing essence. In moments of deep quiet, even now, the lineage continues. It appears wherever someone sits alone without fear, listens to darkness without judgment, and trusts what rises gently from within. The keepers are not always recognized as such. They may not even recognize themselves. But the hidden practices survive through them, not as relics of the past, but as quiet currents beneath the surface of human life, waiting patiently, as they always have, for someone willing to listen. In the earliest days of the old circles, magic was never loud. It did not announce itself with bright flames, dramatic gestures, or words meant to astonish. The power they cultivated was quiet, subtle, and deliberate. It was woven into breath, posture, and attention rather than spectacle. It relied on a rhythm of stillness, a patient observation of the world, and the careful shaping of one's own mind and intention. Those who practiced it understood that the universe responded to attentiveness more than to command, and that the unseen world was always present, always listening, and always shifting, but only revealing itself when approached without force. The difference between the old circle ways and later theatrical sorcery was profound. where the latter sought immediate effect. The former sought alignment with what already was. Silence in these traditions was not emptiness. It was a medium through which the practitioner could sense subtle currents, trace hidden patterns, and perceive forces otherwise unnoticed. The world itself was full of murmurs, vibrations, and rhythms that escaped ordinary awareness. Wind through leaves, water flowing over stone, the subtle rise and fall of temperature. All were considered teachers. By sitting quietly, by allowing the mind to settle like sediment in water, the practitioner became attuned to these signals. Each detail carried information about the present moment and the larger patterns in which it existed. It was through silence that the first understanding of intention took root. Intention, however, was not coercion. The old circles never sought to dominate or bend the world violently to their will. Instead, they cultivated a subtle shaping of influence, akin to guiding a stream rather than damming it. The focused attention, when paired with understanding and patience, could create changes that seemed miraculous only to those unaccustomed to the quiet art of listening. A practitioner might sit beside a field, sensing soil and sky, tracking subtle signs of growth or decay, and then plant a seed in precise alignment with the rhythms they had perceived. It was not the ritual itself that caused the growth, but the attention that allowed the practitioner to act in harmony with natural cycles. In this way, silence became the channel through which intention flowed, unforced yet effective. Meditation was central to this practice, but it was unlike the meditations later popularized as abstract exercises. It was active, deeply engaged, and rooted in observation. Practitioners would sit for hours, sometimes days, with minimal movement, listening to their breath, noticing their heartbeat, and tracing their awareness through the layers of the world around them. Every sound, scent, and vibration was noted. The practitioner learned to distinguish between what was merely external noise and what carried significance. This was not an intellectual exercise. It was a cultivation of presence. The mind became a mirror, reflecting subtle currents rather than imposing judgment or narrative. Attention to the earth was equally vital. The old circles understood that human life was entwined with the environment, and that intention without respect for natural law was futile. They walked slowly through forests, along rivers, or across fields, observing patterns in plant growth, the behavior of animals, and the flow of water and wind. They noted the positions of stones, the shadows cast by trees at different times of day, and the changes in soil and air. Each observation informed future actions. To the untrained eye, these movements might appear meandering or idle. To the practitioner, it was not always easy. The mind resists quiet. It seeks distraction, chatter, and urgency. Yet the old circles cultivated patience over long periods. They understood that stillness was not merely a lack of motion, but a state of receptivity. In stillness, one could detect subtleties that rushed or forced attention would miss. A whisper of a change in the wind, a faint rustle in the underbrush, or the subtle shift of shadows in the trees might indicate something significant. These small signs were guides for action, and only those trained in prolonged silence could perceive them fully. Intentionality grew naturally from this foundation of stillness. Occult. When the practitioner had learned to observe without reaction, to listen without impatience, the mind became capable of precise focus. Thoughts were not scattered. Desire was not scattered. Will was concentrated. The practitioner could shape their actions with clarity and coherence, aligning with larger patterns rather than attempting to impose force. Intention without understanding was dangerous, but intention grounded in awareness, and patience became a subtle, potent tool. The old circles understood that power without care could be destructive. Many later sorcerers sought dramatic results through energy and spectacle, forcing outcomes without regard for alignment or consequence. The old circles, in contrast, recognized that the universe responded best to gentle insistence paired with deep comprehension. They observed that action in accordance with natural rhythms was amplified, while forceful action against them led to resistance and often unintended consequences. Silence was the first tool, and intention the second. The practitioner learned to combine them carefully. Even everyday tasks were approached with this philosophy. Planting, harvesting, healing, and crafting were infused with quiet attention and deliberate intention. When preparing remedies from herbs, a practitioner would study the plant's growth patterns, the subtle changes in scent and color, the vibrations of the stems under touch. When tending animals, they observed behavior carefully, noting signals that suggested need or distress. Action was never hasty. Even the simplest gesture was imbued with awareness, making ordinary work a subtle form of the practice. Dreams, too, were engaged with intentionally. Practitioners did not wait passively for visions to arrive. They prepared the body and mind for reception. Breathing slowed, thoughts quieted, and attention focused inward. Symbols and images were not forced but allowed to emerge, carrying insights that might otherwise remain hidden. Upon waking, dreams were reflected upon in silence, their significance considered carefully before being acted upon. This interplay of observation, stillness, and intention created a life that was profoundly integrated with both visible and unseen aspects of reality. Time itself was treated differently in these practices. The old circles did not measure it solely by clocks or calendars, but by patterns, rhythms, and cycles. They observed the movement of the sun, the phase of the moon, the flow of water, and the growth of plants. Events were considered in context rather than in isolation. Rituals were not performed at arbitrary intervals, but at moments when the alignment of external and internal rhythms was optimal. This awareness of timing strengthened the power of intention, allowing action to resonate rather than collide with the natural world. Community, when it existed, was treated with equal subtlety. Practitioners rarely sought attention or control. They influenced through example, through calm presence, and through quiet instruction. Others might adopt gestures, rhythms, or attitudes without explicit teaching, absorbing the principles unconsciously. The old circles understood that force over others was incompatible with true understanding. Power was relational, not coercive, and the most profound influence came through subtle guidance rather than overt demonstration. Over generations, this approach cultivated patience, humility, and discernment. Practitioners learned to observe the unfolding of events, to discern patterns in human behavior, and to act only when alignment suggested efficacy. They learned to recognize the difference between desire and necessity, between impulse and thoughtful act. Even when power was used, it was applied with careful attention to consequence, never as a tool of domination. In this way, silence and intention became not just methods, but principles that guided every facet of life. Even in extreme isolation or danger, the practices persisted. The old circles adapted to challenges without abandoning their core principles. When pursued by suspicion or misunderstanding, they concealed their methods yet continued to cultivate stillness and intention in private. Knowledge, after all, is resilient when it is embedded in habit, awareness, and breath rather than in spectacle or reliance on tools. The quieter the practice, the more enduring it became. Over time, the contrast with theatrical sorcery became sharp. Others sought power through noise, movement, and demonstration. Their magic was impressive but often brittle, dependent on performance and audience. The old circle's approach, by contrast, was subtle, internalized, and patient. It could survive without recognition, without validation, and without immediate effect. Its strength lay in continuity, not flash, in alignment, not coercion. Physical actions were integrated seamlessly into the practice. The posture of the body, the movement of hands, the cadence of steps, and the modulation of breath were all tools for aligning attention. Even the way one ate, walked, or prepared the body for sleep was considered relevant. The practitioner became aware that every gesture could either disperse or concentrate intention. Through repetition and attention, simple acts were transformed into instruments of subtle influence, reinforcing the principles of silence and focus. The environment itself became a teacher. Practitioners listened to storms and rain, to the pattern of birds in flight, to the behavior of animals and insects. They noted the timing of tides, the positions of stars, and the subtle changes in wind and light. No observation was too small. Each detail contributed to a richer understanding of the forces with which they interacted. By aligning their actions with these rhythms, they worked in harmony with reality rather than attempting to impose their will against it. Silence, in particular, was cultivated rigorously. The mind resists quiet and the body resists stillness, yet mastery of both was essential. Practitioners learned to notice internal chatter without attachment, to observe impulses without reaction, and to allow thoughts and emotions to pass like clouds. Through this practice, they achieved a clarity of attention that allowed intention to flow unobstructed. A focused mind aligned with external and internal rhythms became a subtle force, shaping outcomes without coercion. Even relationships were approached through these principles. Rather than seek control or influence, practitioners practiced listening, empathy, and observation. They guided others indirectly, through example and subtle suggestion, never by force. Influence was measured not by obedience but by resonance, the quiet impact of alignment, attentiveness, and integrity. Those who interacted with the old circles often found themselves calmed, centered, and subtly guided, without realizing that their own awareness had been gently shaped. As centuries passed, this approach endured, surviving periods of misunderstanding, persecution, and societal change. The principles of stillness, observation, and focused intention remained relevant because they were not dependent on objects, performance, or recognition. They were ways of being, ways of perceiving, and ways of acting. Even when labels were applied by outsiders, even when practices were misunderstood as dangerous or obscure, the underlying method persisted. Through the cultivation of silence and intention, the old circles developed a profound understanding of interconnection. They recognized that every action, however small, had consequences. By shaping attention carefully, they could act in ways that harmonized with larger patterns, minimizing disruption and maximizing effect. This awareness fostered patience, humility, and respect for the complexity of life. Their power was subtle, enduring, and deeply integrated into the fabric of existence. Even today, remnants of this practice persist. Wherever someone sits quietly, listening to the movement of wind or water, observing subtle changes in light or shadow, and aligning their actions with awareness rather than impulse, the same principles are being applied. The cultivation of silence, the attentive observation of the world, and the shaping of reality through focused intention continue as living threads in human experience, testaments to the enduring wisdom of the old circles. In this way, power was never loud or flashy. It did not announce itself with fanfare or demand recognition. It was a quiet current, a deep pulse, an alignment of breath, mind, and world. It relied on patience, observation, and care. It flourished in silence and thrived in stillness. Through deliberate intention, guided by awareness and respect for natural and human rhythms, the old circles shaped reality subtly, harmoniously, and profoundly, leaving a legacy that continues to ripple quietly beneath the surface of human life. In the earliest days of the old circles, power was never loud. It did not announce itself with bright flames, booming incantations, or dramatic gestures intended to awe onlookers. The magic of the old circles was subtle, deliberate, and deeply patient, woven into the rhythm of breath, posture, and focused attention rather than performance. Those who practiced it understood that the world itself was alive with patterns, rhythms, and silent currents, and that these currents responded not to force, but to awareness. The unseen world was always present, always attentive, always shifting, but it revealed its secrets only to those who approached without haste, without arrogance, and without spectacle. The difference between this quiet art and the theatrical sorcery that would emerge in later centuries was profound. While others sought immediate results, the old circles sought alignment with themselves, with their surroundings, and with the subtle threads connecting all things. Silence, in the old circle tradition, was not emptiness. It was a medium through which practitioners could perceive subtle signs, trace hidden patterns, and feel the pulse of life around them. The world was alive with vibrations invisible to ordinary perception. The whisper of wind through trees, the gentle flow of water over stones, the faint resonance of the earth beneath their feet. By sitting quietly, the practitioner allowed these murmurs to reach their awareness. They learned to distinguish between ordinary noise and messages embedded in natural rhythms. Sound, scent, shadow, or shift in temperature was meaningful when approached with patience. Silence became a form of listening, a bridge between the physical and the unseen, and a foundation for shaping intention. Intention, however, was never coercion. The old circles did not seek to dominate or bend the world to their will through brute force. Instead, they practiced a form of subtle guidance, akin to directing a stream rather than damming it. Focused attention, coupled with understanding and patience, could create change that appeared miraculous only to those untrained in the art of quiet perception. A practitioner might sit beside a field, sensing the alignment of soil, wind, and sun, and plant seeds in harmony with natural rhythms. The act itself was simple, but because it was executed with awareness and intention, it resonated with the broader currents of life, producing outcomes that seemed beyond ordinary understanding. The practitioner learned that true power emerges not from coercion, but from attunement, patience, and disciplined focus. Meditation was central to this practice, though it differed from later abstract exercises of the mind. It was not about emptying thought entirely or seeking altered states for spectacle. It was active and deeply engaged, rooted in observation of both self and environment. Practitioners would sit for hours, sometimes days, with minimal movement attending to breath, heartbeat, and the subtle interplay of sensations. They observed the rise and fall of thoughts without attachment, noticing the way emotions shifted and bodies responded. Each sound and movement in the surrounding world was noted, examined, and understood. The goal was not control, but clarity, a mind capable of perceiving subtle cues and subtle potentials. Observation of the earth itself was equally vital. The old circles recognized that human life was intertwined with environmental patterns, and that power without respect for these patterns was fleeting. They moved slowly through forests, along rivers, across fields, noting the behavior of animals, the alignment of stones, the shifts of wind, and the changing shadows of the sun. They studied plant growth, water flow, and soil texture. Every detail informed future actions. To an untrained eye, this might appear as wandering or idleness, but in truth, it was careful engagement with the world, a constant calibration of awareness and action. Practitioners learned that aligning with natural rhythms magnified their intentions, while acting against them dissipated energy and produced resistance. Stillness was not merely physical, but mental and emotional. The mind, restless by nature, resisted quiet. The body, accustomed to motion, resisted pause, yet the old circles cultivated both. Through prolonged practice, they developed patience, persistence, and a refined sense of attention. In stillness, subtle patterns that escaped ordinary perception revealed themselves. A faint rustle in the underbrush, a sudden shift in the wind, or the slow settling of clouds could indicate opportunity or warning. Practitioners learned to wait, to hold their presence lightly, and to act only when alignment allowed. Silence became the conduit through which intention flowed, carrying energy with minimal friction. Intentionality, once rooted in stillness, became a living, breathing force. Thoughts were no longer scattered, desires were focused, and will was concentrated. The practitioner learned to shape outcomes by acting in resonance with natural forces rather than against them. Action and attention merged. This approach required discernment, patience, and humility, for intention without comprehension was dangerous. Acting impulsively, even with strong desire, could produce unforeseen consequences. Yet intention applied with understanding, alignment, and care became powerful, subtle, and enduring. The old circles were keenly aware of the consequences of misapplied power. Later sorcerers might seek immediate effect, dramatic change, or dominance over others. The old circles recognized that force against natural currents led to resistance, disruption, and imbalance. Efficacy, they understood, lay in observation, preparation, and precise, informed action. Silence, attention, and intention were not passive. They were the most active forms of influence, capable of shaping outcomes without struggle, without spectacle, and without harm. Even daily tasks were imbued with this philosophy: planting, gathering, Crafting or preparing food became exercises in alignment, attention, and intention. When preparing herbal remedies, practitioners observed the subtleties of plant growth, scent, texture, and vibration. They noted timing, soil, and environmental influence. When tending animals, they watched behavior, mood, and energy, adjusting actions to maintain balance. Every movement, every gesture, every breath became a reflection of awareness, a quiet instrument through which attention and intention shaped the world. Dreams played a crucial role in refining intention. Practitioners prepared for sleep as for a ritual. The body and mind were calmed, light and sound minimized, and attention focused inward. Dreams were not forced but allowed to emerge naturally. Symbols and images carried subtle messages, guiding the practitioner toward understanding of patterns, potential, and consequence. Upon waking, dreams were reflected upon quietly, without rush or interpretation imposed prematurely. Each image was considered within context, examined in light of patterns observed in waking life, and integrated into decisions and actions. Dreams became a bridge connecting inner awareness with outer alignment. Time, too, was experienced differently. The old circles measured not in hours or calendars alone, but in cycles, rhythms, and patterns. Rituals and acts of intention were performed in accordance with these natural rhythms, amplifying efficacy. Alignment with temporal flow reinforced the harmony between human action and the broader currents of life, ensuring that intention was coherent, responsive, and integrated. Community interactions followed the same principles. The old circles did not seek control over others but influenced subtly through presence and example. Others absorbed the rhythms and practices unconsciously, adopting gestures, pauses, and awareness through proximity. Leadership, when it occurred, was rarely overt. Influence was relational and gentle, operating through resonance rather than authority. This non-coercive approach allowed the traditions to persist even within societies that misunderstood or feared them. Over generations, the cultivation of silence and intention strengthened patience, humility, discernment, and ethical awareness. Practitioners learned to differentiate between necessity and desire, between impulsive action and considered response. Even when power was exercised, it was applied with awareness of consequence, respect for the environment, and attunement to larger patterns. This created a form of influence both subtle and enduring, imperceptible yet profound. Even in times of danger or persecution, the practices endured. The old circles adapted their methods without abandoning their principles. When scrutiny threatened, rituals were simplified or internalized, practiced privately rather than publicly. Knowledge embedded in habit, observation, and awareness could survive invisibly, ensuring continuity. The quieter the practice, the more resilient it became, able to withstand misunderstanding, fear, or suppression. Physical gestures, posture, and breath were integral to aligning attention and intention. Every movement was deliberate. Simple acts, such as walking, preparing food, or even sitting in contemplation, were approached with care, transforming them into subtle instruments of influence. The practitioner learned to act with coherence, ensuring that each gesture reinforced focus rather than dispersing it. Through repetition, habit, and awareness, ordinary actions became extensions of meditative presence and intentional shaping of reality. The natural environment remained an essential guide. Observation of weather patterns, animal behavior, tides, wind, and light informed decisions and action. Nothing was insignificant. Every nuance could provide insight into timing, opportunity, or consequence. Practitioners learned to read the world as an extension of consciousness, allowing intention to harmonize with it, rather than oppose it. Silence, refined over years of practice, created a heightened sensitivity. Internal chatter and distraction were noticed but not indulged. Impulses were observed and released. Through this, a clarity of attention emerged, allowing intention to flow unhindered. Even in the modern world, long after the old circles faded into shadow and silence, fragments of their practices survive, scattered through the layers of human culture, memory, and perception. These remnants are not obvious, and they rarely appear as full rituals or systems of knowledge. They have instead been distilled into smaller forms, hidden within folklore, protective charms, shadow symbolism, and subtle cultural gestures. The human imagination, which once resonated directly with the currents of the unseen, continues to echo these practices, even as society has grown louder, faster, and more mechanized. The murmur of the old circles persists, faint but enduring, in places where attention, awareness, and quiet reverence for subtle forces still find purchase. Folklore is one of the most enduring vessels for this ancient wisdom. Stories passed down through generations often retain the structures, symbols, and lessons of the old circles without explicitly revealing their origins. Tales of spirits who guard forests, rivers, or mountains, or of shadows that shift unexpectedly to guide or warn, are echoes of older practices. These narratives encode observation, intuition, and attention to patterns. The protagonists of such tales often succeed not by brute force or clever trickery, but by noticing subtle signs, moving with care, and responding thoughtfully to the environment around them. Even when clothed in myth or exaggeration, the underlying principles remain: attentiveness, alignment, and respect for unseen currents. Protective charms are another legacy. Across cultures, small objects have been imbued with meaning, carrying power not in themselves, but in the deliberate attention, intention, and symbolic resonance placed upon them. Amulets, talismans, and tokens of safety persist in countless forms. A small stone carried in a pocket, carved figure hung over a doorway, a circle traced in salt on a threshold. They act as reminders of alignment, focus, and mindfulness. They anchor attention and shape perception, calling the mind towards subtle awareness and careful action, just as the old circles intended. In this way, objects carry legacy quietly, preserving habit, focus, and ritual, even when formal knowledge has faded. Shadow symbolism, too, remains central. The human fascination with darkness, twilight, and hidden spaces is ancient. Shadows represent unknown possibilities, boundaries, and subtle presence. In architecture, art, and literature, shadows are used to suggest depth, mystery, and hidden influence. Even the practice of pausing to observe how light and shadow interact in daily life is a quiet remnant of the old circle approach, noticing nuance, observing subtle change, and aligning attention with patterns that are not immediately obvious. Shadows teach patience, humility, and attentiveness, just as they did when practitioners of the old circles moved deliberately through forests, fields, and quiet spaces, reading patterns invisible to casual observation. Dreams, too, retain their significance. Even in a world dominated by schedules, screens, and constant stimulation, people continue to notice, remember, and interpret dreams. Dreams are fleeting windows into perception and intuition, a bridge to subtle currents in the mind and environment. Modern dream journals, reflection practices, and therapeutic techniques echo ancient methods of observing, recording, and learning from the unseen. While the language has changed, the underlying principle remains. The attentive mind can extract meaning from subtle signals, whether they arrive in waking life or in the landscapes of sleep. Beyond folklore, charms, shadows, and dreams, the human psyche itself carries traces of old circle practice. Humans retain a persistent sense that unseen forces are near, that the world is richer than mere material observation suggests. This belief is not always literal. It may appear as intuition, gut feeling, synchronicity, or the sense of being watched or guided by unseen patterns. People intuitively recognize that life contains layers beyond immediate perception. Fear, intuition, insight, coincidence, and resonance continue to shape decision-making and experience. The murmurs of ancient wisdom persist, quiet but persistent, beneath the noise of modern life, guiding those who are willing to listen. Even in the modern world, long after the old circles faded into shadow, fragments of their practices continue to survive, quietly shaping human awareness and behavior. These remnants are seldom obvious, and rarely appear as full rituals or elaborate ceremonies, instead, they exist in subtle forms. In folklore, protective charms, shadow symbolism, the alignment of daily habits with natural rhythms, and the persistent human sense that Unseen forces linger just beyond immediate perception. While the world has grown louder, faster, and more mechanized, the soft murmurs of the old circles continue to echo, carried by intuition, habit, and cultural memory, reminding those willing to listen that life is always more layered than it first appears. Folklore serves as one of the most enduring vessels for this ancient wisdom. Stories passed down through generations preserve the lessons, symbols, and rhythms of the old circles, often in disguised form. Tales of spirits guarding forests, rivers, or mountains, or of shadows that moved to warn, guide, or protect, are subtle reflections of ancient practices. Heroes in these stories rarely triumph through force. Instead, they succeed by observing the smallest details, noticing patterns others miss, and acting with patience and insight. Even when clothed in exaggeration or myth, these narratives encode essential principles: attentiveness, alignment with natural patterns, and the cultivation of intuition. Generations who repeat these stories, often without knowing their origins, maintain the underlying practice of noticing and responding to subtle currents in the world. Protective charms are another persistent thread. Across cultures, objects imbued with symbolic meaning have been used to anchor attention and intention. Amulets, talismans, and tokens, whether carried in a pocket, hung over a doorway, or traced on thresholds, serve as reminders of focus, care, and mindful awareness. Their power does not reside in the materials themselves, but in the attention and intention placed upon them. This mirrors the old circle practice of subtle shaping, using physical cues to cultivate mindfulness, focus, and alignment. Even today, people clutch charms before important events or follow small rituals for protection, showing that these tiny acts of awareness continue to shape perception and action. Shadow symbolism, too, remains deeply embedded in modern culture. Humans are drawn to darkness, twilight, and hidden spaces, instinctively recognizing that shadows carry meaning beyond mere absence of light. In literature, art, architecture, and film, shadows are used to suggest depth, mystery, hidden influence, or subtle change. This fascination mirrors the old circle practice of observing subtle shifts and aligning attention with patterns that are not immediately obvious. Watching how light and shadow interact, noticing the quiet movement of form, or reflecting on the impermanence of shape cultivates the same patient attentiveness that guided ancient practitioners through forests, valleys, and quiet spaces. Dreams continue to preserve a connection to the old circles. Even in the modern world of screens, schedules, and constant stimulation, humans remain attentive to dreams, seeking guidance, insight, or reflection. Practices such as keeping dream journals, noting recurring symbols, or reflecting quietly upon dreams echo ancient methods of deliberate preparation and observation. The principle remains: attentive reflection on subtle signals, whether in the mind, the environment, or the unseen world, can reveal patterns, guidance, and insight that are otherwise inaccessible. Dreams, like shadows and charms, act as conduits between conscious awareness and subtle influence. Modern rituals, though often secularized, retain echoes of these practices. Festivals tied to seasonal cycles, quiet observances of life events, and repeated gestures of mindfulness all trace back to a legacy of attentive action. Even hobbies such as gardening, hiking, or crafting can become forms of alignment, where focus, patience, and awareness produce effects larger than the individual acts themselves. People may not label these acts as magical, but the underlying principles, observation, intention, and alignment, remain central. In this way, the old circle's emphasis on subtlety and attentiveness persists, quietly influencing behavior across centuries. Cultural memory plays a critical role in the persistence of these practices. Even when direct instruction is lost, motifs, stories, and gestures repeat across time and space. Architectural patterns, domestic rituals, and communal habits encode subtle knowledge of rhythm, timing, and awareness. Through repetition and habit, these practices embed themselves in human behavior, maintaining a continuity of attentiveness and intention across generations. Even when disconnected from their original context, the practices survive because they are effective, resonant, and adaptable. Observation of environmental rhythms is another channel through which the legacy persists. Farmers, gardeners, fishermen, and sailors align their activities with wind, tides, moon phases, and seasonal shifts. Though modern techniques may incorporate technology, the underlying principle mirrors the old circle approach. Careful observation, alignment with patterns, and deliberate action. Attention to subtle environmental cues, whether in nature or in human society, continues to shape outcomes. The practice of synchronizing action with natural rhythms is an enduring testament to the effectiveness of attentive, patient engagement. Human psychology itself carries echoes of these ancient practices. The persistent intuition that unseen forces influence life, that outcomes are affected by attention and awareness, or that patterns exist beyond immediate perception, reflects the cognitive legacy of the old circles. People may experience gut feelings, sudden insights, or subtle coincidences, often dismissed as coincidence or superstition. Yet these perceptions are reminders that attention and intention, cultivated over generations, continue to shape perception and action. Awareness, reflection, and subtle guidance remain active forces in human experience, even in the absence of formal rituals. Modern spiritual practices continue this legacy explicitly. Meditation, mindfulness, energy work, and quiet reflection all emphasize alignment, observation, and intentionality. The language and context may differ from ancient practice, but the underlying principles remain. Cultivate stillness, attend to subtle patterns, and direct intention deliberately. These methods refine perception, foster insight, and allow action to resonate with larger currents, echoing the teachings of the old circles. Even secular adaptations such as reflective journaling, contemplative walks, or focused attention exercises reinforce these principles and demonstrate their relevance in contemporary life. Art and literature also preserve the subtle influence of the old circles. Themes of hidden guidance, shadowed truth, quiet observation, and the interplay of seen and unseen recur across centuries. Storytellers encode lessons in attentiveness, alignment, and patient action. Protagonists succeed not through raw force or spectacle, but through observation, insight, and careful engagement with subtle currents. These cultural echoes reinforce the persistence of attentive practice, showing that even imagination is shaped by principles long cultivated by the old circles. Even urban life carries subtle currents of this legacy. Observing human behavior, traffic patterns, and environmental cues in cities mirrors the attentiveness once directed toward forests, rivers, and valleys. Awareness of nuance, timing, and consequence continues to guide effective action, proving that the principles of alignment, observation, and intention are adaptable across contexts. In the modern world, where noise, haste, and spectacle dominate, these subtle currents persist, offering guidance, alignment, and enduring connection to the layered complexity of life. The legacy of the Murmurs remains, waiting to be noticed, understood, and carried forward by those willing to engage attentively with the unseen threads that shape human experience.